both always say, thank God for Mississippi. Just saying, just saying. So I am Carla Gray, and today we're going to do self-evaluations, transition plans, and ADA audits, and how to create welcoming, inclusive, and ADA compliant park and recreation systems. I am going to tell you there is no way we're going to get really a lot of detail going on this. You just can't. There's so much information. But what I want to do is, I was trying to see if there was somebody behind where I needed to stop from there. What I want to do is at least give y'all a decent overview so you can see maybe where you need to go, what you need to get more information on. I also bought some fun stuff. If you ever want to know, this isn't all of it, but these are some of the main things that I use when I do audits. So, and I'm going to see if this is going to work. Oh, on the side. Oh, that would help, wouldn't it? All right. So for today's discussion, we're going to do a little quick level setting. I'm not big on buzzwords, but I couldn't think of something else. I put level setting, so I'm sorry. We're going to talk really briefly about the ADA and the administrative requirements. Then we're going to talk about the components that you need to do when you are looking at a self-evaluation transition plan, which is a self-evaluation and your physical accessibility audits, and then the end result. And that's how everything all comes together all at once. Just for transparency purposes, and because my insurance tells me to say this, make sure that you know the information being provided is intended for general informational purposes only. What this essentially says is if you have something specific in your entity, agency, organization, city, county, town, whatever it may be, speak with your legal folks there, okay? Because they're going to be the ones who are really going to guide you. I'm going to add to that, they might guide you in a way that you don't feel would be the correct way, but they're going to be the ones that are going to guide your organization. They're going to be the ones who are going to say to you, if somebody comes to you and let's just say they ask for a program modification to have medication administered during summer day camp. This is one of the ones I hear all the time. And your legal might go, we're not comfortable with that. We're not going to do it. Just know you need to document them telling you we're not going to do that. For you, you need to document that because there have been successful suits, many successful suits, and that's something that is a reasonable modification. But if your legal tells you no, follow what they say, right? Just document it. Make sure you're set. So how do we end up here? My name is Carla Gray. I am an LRT, CTRS, ADAC, MED, all the good stuff. I have spent the last, Terry alluded to this, but I have spent the last 37 years of my life, which is older than some of you. At least it's not the majority this time. A lot of times when I say that, it's the majority. So I'm older than some of you. Professionally older than some of you are personally. So I've spent the last 37 years of my life working with people with disabilities, doing TR programs, RT programs, however you want to say it, inclusion programs, and ADA compliance. I spent 13 years of my career with the federal government. I'm still currently with a Title II entity, and then I have a consulting LLC, which is what I'm here for today, which is called Accessibility Essentials. Let's see. So let's start by level setting because we don't have a lot of time, like I said, to go deep. But if you have a question, please stop, yell at me, throw something, money preferably, but throw something, get my attention. I'll be happy to answer any question, and we'll figure out how to compress a couple of other things. So in level setting, let's talk really quickly about the ADA. Who knows what the ADA is? Hand back there. Yes, ma'am. Oh, what is it? It is the Americans with Disabilities Act. What is it? What is it? It is a law. A lot of times people confuse the standards, which are guidelines, with the ADA, which is the law. Not only is it a law, it is a civil rights law. It is a civil rights law that is administered by the Department of Justice. For us, pretty much, I think everybody is county, city, town here, right? So for us, we're Title II under the ADA. We'll briefly go over that in a minute. So not only are requirements administered under the Department of Justice, but specifically the Department of Justice tells the Department of Interior if there's an issue, they would be the ones that would investigate us. The Department of Justice would be the one that would sue us. Okay, so if you ever get a call from either the Department of Interior or Department of Justice and they go, hey, we need to chat with you. You know that documentation I was telling you about before? Start getting it together. So the ADA is comprised of 5 titles. We're not going to go deep into these. Some of these you are aware of. Some of them you may not be aware of. Title I. Anybody know what Title I is? If you don't, that's fine. Title I is employment. Most of the time in an agency, Title I is going to be administered by your HR folks. That's just generally how it's done. Title II is who we are. If you're a county, city, town, you're a Title II entity. That is local and state government entities fall under Title II. There's a subtitle A and a subtitle B. Subtitle A is county, city, town, state, and then B has to do with county, city, town, state, transportation. Title III is public accommodations. So if you go to the movies, if you go out to eat, if you go to Planet Fitness, they're covered under Title III. They do have requirements. Title IV has to do with telecommunications and not to confuse that with, I'm sure y'all been seeing a lot of stuff about WCAG lately. And if you don't know what WCAG is, it's how websites and your website has to be compliant. This part of it has to do with relay and closed captioning that's on TV. So that part of the ADA is a check mark, right? And then Title V is something that is kind of a catch-all. So it talks about how attorneys get paid, when they get paid, if they get paid. It talks about retaliation and coercion. It also gives a list, and there was a senator from North Carolina who was heavily involved in that, who has long since passed, so you can guess that there's some interesting stuff in there. There is a list of what's not considered disabilities, and he added in some interesting stuff. So that's one you're never going to really see. What you're going to end up with is going to be potentially Title I, and you would be kind of secondary to that, and then Title II is what you're going to really be following. Now, there are administrative requirements under Title II for how we do things as an entity to be able to follow the ADA. These are the steps to that, and it looks, I know it's kind of crazy, isn't it? But the first thing you have to do, if you are in it, who is in an organization of over 50? For those of you who are not in organizations of over 50, do you count, is it under 50 total count of employees for your entire city, county, town, whatever it is? Does that include all your part-time staff, your seasonal staff, your library staff, your fire department, whoever falls under your entity? Are you above or over 50? If you're under 50, you do not have to, by law, have an ADA coordinator. You don't have to name one. If you have over, you do, by law, have to have one. Now, the difference is, though, it's a really good idea for you to have one. It's a really good idea. But legally, you're not required to. But it's a really, really, really good idea for you to have one. The second thing you have to do that's a requirement under the ADA is that you have to provide a public notice. And that just says, hey, we recognize that this is a law and we will follow it. So you have to do that. A lot of people do it by signage, or they do it on their websites now. You can do it a bunch of different ways. There is not a hard or fast way that you have to do it. Recognize that a lot of these things should have been done because the ADA was signed into law. Anybody want to take a stab at how long it's been? Nope. This is, I'll give you a hint. In July, it was the 34th anniversary. 1990. July 26th of 1990. That does not mean that there weren't laws before that were also, including the Architectural Barriers Act, that was in place, but the ADA itself was signed into law 34 years ago. 34 years ago. So these things should have already been put in place, but you would be surprised at the number of them that aren't, that truly aren't. You have to also have a grievance procedure in place. And that just tells people if you don't agree with us on how we're doing things, this is your process for doing it. And it has to be and it has to be the same for everybody. It doesn't have to be the same for everybody. Like in this room, your agencies don't all have to be the same, but anybody who files a grievance within your agency, it would need to be the same. Okay. Then the next thing is that you have to, and this is where it starts getting, see the little down arrow here, you need to start identifying your internal standards. Okay. What standards are you following to make sure you're in compliance? Most people are going to follow, we were saying earlier, the guidelines. So the guidance, the guidelines, the standards for the ADA, which is going to be the most recent, are the 2010 standards. Some people also follow the outdoor guidelines, which are federal standards. You probably do in some respects. Most of you would follow also the standards under the Department of Insurance for North Carolina when it comes to building greenways, because they're the ones that set that standard. Then there are also internal standards that you can do within your own agency that helps elevate where you're at with meeting ADA and meeting ADA compliance. An agency I may or may not work for, when I have to have a real job, we have a series of internal standards that include when we're going to use adult changing tables, how we're going to put grab bars in at urinals, how we are going to affix benches, how we are going to put in grills and what type of grills we're going to use. Little things that a lot of times people don't think of, but those internal standards are intended to create a more welcoming and inclusive experience for folks. The next part is going to be, you have to conduct a self-evaluation. And we talked a minute ago about how with the ADA coordinator, under 50 does not have to have a ADA coordinator. Who do you think needs to have a self-evaluation? The department? Is there a size limit to the department? No? Y'all agree or disagree? Yes. Yes.
Typically in county or city departments, which department houses the ADA coordinator?
Typically, okay. Let me answer that here 1 second. The number is for the self-evaluation, the number in your entity, whether it's a city, county, state, there is no minimum. Everybody has to have done a self-evaluation. The difference is if you have over 50 employees in your city, county, state, you have to maintain that self-evaluation for at least 3 years. That's the only difference. Everybody has to. Who typically houses it? It is going to be generally at that highest level. But the ADA also does not tell you you just have to have one ADA coordinator. There are some entities, especially larger entities, who have multiple ones. There are some entities, depending on who has the bulk of the things that has to be evaluated, they will house it. And Park and Rec, chances are y'all own the bulk of the city, county, state-owned, right? Because you've got parks. The only time that it might not be that is if transportation is also under you, because each individual bus stop is considered separately. But chances are, park and recreation, regardless of what your entity is, county, city, state, you're going to most likely have the majority of them. So when you're doing transition plans, chances are it's going to be park and rec that's going to be most heavily involved with it. When you do the self-evaluation, again, we're going to talk about this in a little bit more detail. You have to do everything, right? Facilities, sites, training, programs, services, activities. You have to then develop a list of all of your accessible everything. Programs, spaces, written material, anything you have to have you have to develop a list of your PSAs, which are programs, services, and activities, and you have to make that available to the public. During that whole process as well, you're required to have public involvement. There is a saying within the disability community that has been since before the Architectural Barriers Act, and the saying is, nothing about us without us. You cannot make determination for me without involving me. And so that's where the public involvement comes in. You have to have people with disabilities involved in the development of this transition plan. And then the last thing that you're required to do is to actually develop the transition. Well, it's next to, this is 6. We'll get to 6B in a second. The 6 is the transition plan. You have to develop them. You had 2 years to develop that. So by 1992, you should have had a developed transition plan. Does everybody have a transition plan? Do you know if you have a transition plan? A lot of people, you know, you don't have a transition plan. That's it. Okay, that's it. Yeah. And a few people do. A lot of people don't. You're not alone. If you don't, you're not alone. You aren't alone. If you do, when was the last time it was updated? Within the last 34 years? Within the last 20 years? Oh, we got a 20-year here. Within the last 10 years? Within the last 5 years? Within the last 2 years there? And I know of one other that was within the last 6 months. They're big, they're cumbersome, they're hard to do. And if you're starting from scratch, it really, it can be kind of scary. So we're going to talk about that here in a second. So the components of, and just as the majority of the pictures on here are going to be of real places that are around the state somewhere here. And I put this one in here, and we'll talk about it in a second as well, because this is a historic seating. It's historic seating. It's bench seating. It's in a bowl for a field. And a lot of people will go, oh, it's historic, I don't have to do it. It's historic, I don't have to do it. Correct or incorrect? Huh? You say correct? Did you say correct? That's what people say, yes. Oh, and to an extent, they are correct. The time when you don't have to do historic, because y'all, seriously, North Carolina, y'all know y'all like to put everything as historic, right? Everything's on the register. Everything. I went somewhere and they said, this is historic trail. It's a trace. It's not even a trail. It's a trace. It's an old trace from whatever. And they put it on, right? So when you have something that's designated as historic, you do have to have it as part of your audit. You do have to look at it for compliance. You do have to make it accessible. The only time you have an exemption to that is if when they did that historic designation, if it's listed on there. So I was at this barn years and years and years ago when it was actually, I think, the real barn. I heard this one burnt. I'm sorry. But this is beautiful. This is absolutely gorgeous. I don't know if it was a historic barn before. Was it? Was it not? Tell me yes. Just fib to me. Yes, it was. Okay. So it was if this was a historic barn and it was on the registry, whether it was on the local, state, or national registry, You would have to look at what component of it was on the registry. If the vestibule was on the registry, that's the part that you get an exemption for. If it's the roof, that's the part you get an exemption for. If it's those funny little swirly things that they put at the corners because it was some mill person who did it and he only did X number and it was just an amazing and this is a lost art, that's the only thing you don't have to make accessible. But not many people are going to be climbing up to the roof to see those things, right? So with the first thing you're going to do is the self-evaluation, right? When you do the self-evaluation, and I'm not going to make y'all read this, but this is the actual section of the law that says this is what you have to do. You have to do that. You have to do it within 1 year. It tells you all the things you have to do. And when you're doing the self-evaluation, these are the things that you have to evaluate. A lot of times people think self-evaluation transition plan, I just have to look at the physical stuff, right? A lot of people think that. But the reality of it is you have to look at every program, service, or activity. Every program, service, or activity. That includes all of your amenities. The benches you have in your park, the grills that you have in your park, the water fountains, all amenities that you have. You have to look at all of your equipment. Do you offer soft play? Do you have soft play pieces? Do you have fitness equipment that people use? Not necessarily the stationary, but do you have like weights? Do you have different fitness equipment? You have to look at that. Do you have, if you have a creative arts class and you're doing painting, you have to look at the equipment you use with that. If you're doing ceramics, you have to look at the equipment you're doing with that. You have to evaluate your programs and your community engagement. I have seen some of I really want to just get a list of some of the most amazing programs that people do because they're like, oh, we do this great program. You have to evaluate that. If you are doing a art program for seniors that involves getting native North Carolina clay, they do that. North Carolina clay, and you're taking that group out there to dig up that clay in order to then be able to form historically accurate pottery. You have to evaluate that program through the lens of accessibility. You have to look at your virtual platforms and spaces, and that can get really tricky. You have to look at your contracts. When's the last time y'all have looked at your contracts? When's the last time anybody has looked at your contract to see if there is language in there that says whoever you're contracting with cannot violate any provisions of the ADA? Is that in there? Because if not, you are going to be held accountable as an entity if there is a violation of the ADA. You're going to be the one that's going to be held accountable. If you have partners, you have to look at your partner programs. There is, if you do substantial support for people have partners that they do things with, sports. What's something, who wants to share one thing that you partner with? Okay. Civic or, yes. Okay. They are in violation of the ADA programs that they offer. Are they your fields? Some of them. Could they do the program without y'all? So those some of them that they can't do without you, you're liable for. If it's something that can't happen without you, either your monetary support or your staffing support or your spaces or your equipment, if they can't do that without you, then you are substantially supporting that program, which means they're not compliant, you're not compliant. No matter anything else, that's where it becomes. So you have to look at what that level of support is for them. So you have to look at your partners. You have to look at all your physical assets. Most people get that. Like they go, we got to be out in the park. I got to see what the grades are and what the benches look like. Most people get that part, but we'll talk about it in a little bit more detail in a second here.
Now, we partner with Kennedy Strong Foundation to help assess our programs to make sure for inclusion. But we can, if, in youth athletics, if someone requests an accommodation, we work with our risk and Kennedy Strong to make sure we're not changing the scope of the program, because you can't change some things for an accommodation. But in those situations, if we do, someone files a claim and we follow those processes to the best of our ability, we are still liable.
Which is it's challenging. And one of the things too, because when we were talking about level setting, so we want to make sure everybody is using common language. And most people say accommodation. We don't accommodate people who use our services. We accommodate staff who work for us. So according to the ADA, Title I, if you're doing a Title I staff accommodation, program modification. So anything for us is going to be a modification. We're modifying it to make sure that they are able to fully participate, whoever, however. And again, this is kind of one of those things, we don't have a lot of time to go a deep dive on this, but there are certain defenses. I would caution you against using them as much as possible. And the reason why I would caution you against that is because historically a lot of people have used those defenses as exclusionary opportunities. So it gets really kind of tricky. One of those is, does it change the essential function of that program? Another one people use a lot of times is that it is going to be an administrative burden. A lot of people use that. Oh, it's administratively, it's going to be a burden. It's going to cost us X amount of money. Is there somebody who'll give it up about your agency or your entity? What is the highest budgetary dollar that you have? And if not, I'll give up somebody else.
For what?
What's the highest budgetary dollar that you have? As a budget, what is your 11 million? Is that for who?
Park projects, bond
Okay.
projects, greenway projects.
You city, county, town?
City.
City. Okay. What's your city budget? Because I don't care what the park budget is.
391 million.
Okay, 391 million. So if somebody comes to you and you say, administrative burden, we don't have the funding to do that, DOJ is going to come in and go, $391 million and you can't pay for an ADA ASL interpreter at $100 a person? Right? So you have to really be cautious about that. That's something that a lot of people go, but my budget is only, and I hear this from folks all the time. People say, I'm doing a aquatics program. I only have a budget of they only give me like $1,000 a year. I don't have that. But the question is, what's your highest level? Not what your individual program is, not what your department is, not what some folks have divisions that are departments, divisions, not your division, not your whatever. What is the highest budgetary level? Again, giving somebody else up. I've had staff who've used that before. And the question I always have is, $2 billion with a B? $2 billion with a B, and you can't afford to do what? So it's kind of one of those that you have to be really cautious about using that. All of those defenses you have to be really cautious about, and there's certain steps. And I get too, a lot of times when you don't have the staffing or people who have that information, it can be really tricky to make those decisions and determinations. Getting back on this real quick. Social media has to be accessible. How you put things out there. When you put things on your website, do you use alt text? Do you not use alt text? Do you put out stuff? People love this part of it. When you put forms on your website for people to fill out, do you use PDFs? Anybody use PDFs? And a lot of people still don't know that. PDFs are not universally accessible. But PDFs are supposed to be universally accessible, right? But they're not. Some people who use readers, screen readers, their PDF reader will read the way that the PDF was done. So if you have it meant to go from top to bottom and from left to right, but you had to edit something over here on the right-hand side, and that was the last thing you did, your screen reader, for people who are blind or have different visual acuity, the screen reader will go top, right bottom, left. It will go to wherever your last edits were. And you know how we edit things, how we see them, and it's like, oh wow, I spell checked it, but it didn't pick it up on page whatever. It's going to go to that. So screen readers read differently. So PDFs, we do that. People don't think about it. They send out writable forms, same thing. So you have to really look at those. You need to look at your forms. You need to look at your policies. You need to look at your effective communication. Do you know where to get something brailled? Anybody here know where to get something brailled? You cannot answer this. Does anybody, because I know she knows this, does anybody know where to get something brailled? Go to Google. Go to Google. Do you know how quickly you can get it turned around and be brailled? Do you know where in your area where to get somebody who does ASL, who can be an ASL interpreter? And I don't mean like me. I can finger spell, and then we had some kids who were camp counselors who were deaf, and they taught us all the dirty words, you know. I can do that too. I'm not talking about that. The way that the ADA reads, and there is a North Carolina state law that dictates ASL interpreters.
Now, we have a contract with an outside group.
Mm-hmm.
If we need interpretation, if we need translator,
Mm-hmm.
if we need anything,
Mm-hmm.
we call and they provide.
And some people do, and you're fine doing that. You're fine doing that. You have to have it they have to be able to do that within a reasonable time. It doesn't mean you have to have somebody on staff to do it, right? But you have to have somebody who's qualified. And in North Carolina, qualified means they have to be licensed if they're doing ASL. So we have a lot of folks in North Carolina who are not primarily first language English speakers, right? So what would you do? And you may or may not know this, but ASL is not universal across the world. We like to think that because, you know, we are English speakers from America, but it's not universal. Every country has its own language. And in some countries, like if you're in China, there are multiple sign languages. Multiple. So if you had somebody who came in, needed a modification, it's a reasonable modification, and said, hey, I need Portuguese sign language, how do you make that happen? You may have somebody who, yeah, you hope. I can tell you right now, there is nobody that does Portuguese from DC to Atlanta. I can guarantee that one. There isn't. We tried. They don't exist. But what do? Do you have a process? So these are the types of things you need to start thinking of when you're doing. You're not going to get dinged for saying, I don't have this. You're going to get dinged for saying, I don't have it and I don't care that I don't have it. That's where you're going to get dinged when things happen. So it's actually reviewing what you do have and not going, we don't have it, I'm not going to worry about it. It's we don't have it, now what do we need to put in place to make it happen? If we do, and you can, especially when you're talking about communication, there are places that you can contract with. There are tools that you can get if you needed something brailled real quick. And I'm going to leave these up here when we're done so you can see some of the things. This is those wonderful little label makers, right? The Braille label maker. I don't have to read Braille. I've got my cheat on here. So I can go to it, and if I pass a sign that does not have Braille on it, and it's a sign that's required, like a restroom, I can do it real quick until I can get that sign replaced. Right? You just need to know where some of your resources are. You have to have your training has to be accessible. Your wayfinding and signage has to be. You have to review it. Your transportation. Do y'all have people have vans? People have. Do you have lift vans in your? I'm not gonna keep looking back here because she's just like, no, we don't have any of it. But again, you don't have to have it. Do you know where to get it? Do you know where to get it? Can you partner with the school system to get it? Is there some place that you can rent it from? You just need to catalog it, what we don't have, and then what's our process for if we do. So let's see. Somebody should notice something on here. Miss Cox. Isn't it a gorgeous carousel? Your carousel has to be accessible. Could be. It's historic. It's historic. It was not, the guys there told me it was built in 1953. It could be. But everything has to be, and there are different, now here's the thing, when you're looking at the standards and you're reviewing this, the carousel, how do you review it? One of the, historic. It's historic. And everything is on it. That dragon, that plastic dragon that's on there, it's historic. But here's one of the things, though. With that, it might be historic. There might be exemptions to it. But the other thing is, there is a set of standards that are totally different for amusement rides. So we would be you're going to have to, when you do your self-evaluation, you're going to have to review that under those standards. Under those standards. This very nice little picturesque little picnic table by the lake is gorgeous there too. That other one that's out there, it's gorgeous there too. That kiosk that has the information on it that's stuck in the tree, it's gorgeous. It's absolutely gorgeous. None of them are accessible because there's, first off, no path of travel. We can't get to it. No path of travel. And then secondly, if those are the only two picnic tables there, you need to have at least 10% of your stuff that's accessible. All you do.
There's a picnic table to the right of there that you don't see that does have a larger pad that's connected to the sidewalk. Then you're okay.
You get a D minus. Yes, you do. And that's the thing. If you meet the standards of the ADA, you've gotten a D minus, right? Because the standards were written at the very lowest minimum that you can get by with. The very lowest, very lowest. But yes, you would. Yeah. And you do the little pathway. Yeah. There wasn't another one next to it, but But so you have to look at those things. You look at how you make things accessible. Do you have food truck? Everybody loves a food truck. I swear, I love a food truck, and there's nobody here from my little town, which is kind of sad. But there is somebody from my county who's here, who's close to me. Again. But everybody loves a food truck. My little town, we were supposed to have little food trucks that come out. They didn't show up any this year, which we were all disappointed about. But if they did, your food trucks, if you are sponsoring that event, your food trucks have to be accessible. How do you make a food truck accessible? You could lower it, but are you going to tell them that they have to go cut into their food truck and lower it? No. There are times when, kind of like phoning the friend, that you were like, I'd be on the phone calling. It's kind of the same thing. You put a process in place. And again, you would document that process. This is all part of your self-evaluation transition plan. The process would be, you're going to come out, if there's somebody who says, you have a little sign, if you need any assistance, let us know. And we'll walk out and we'll take your order, we'll bring your food to you, whatever it may be. You put a process in place and you document that process. But you do the self-evaluation on it to see if it is or is not accessible. If you've got trails, that's not me, is it? If you've got trails, how do you make some of your more rugged trails, how do you make them accessible? What do? You buy equipment that makes it work. I asked you a question about something like that, didn't I? I asked a question a while back about who in North Carolina has all-terrain wheelchairs. And the answer was North Carolina Wildlife. So I called North Carolina Wildlife. Hey, I hear y'all have. And they said, yeah, we used to. But we don't use them anymore for a variety of reasons. Yeah. It's a whole big story with that. But there is an entity in North Carolina, a Title II entity, which would be city, county, state, who does have them, and they'll be made available to the public starting at the end of this month.
I do have a quick question. We are doing splash pads
Uh-huh.
In our parks.
Uh-huh.
First time.
Love splash pads.
And we are going to get aquatic wheelchairs to be to accommodate people, and they're going to have to request it.
Mm-hmm.
But we were going to, do we need or can we assess a fee, or is it better to just keep them free as they?
You cannot. It is not legal to charge somebody for something that makes it accessible to them. Unless you say to somebody, we're charging everybody for the chaise lounges that we use, you cannot charge just because it's accessible. But that's a good, valid question, because a lot of people do that. A lot of people ask that. You know, just in general, hey, this is something that's different. Can we do this? It's not legal to do that. But it's a great question.
Then that's why I was asking.
Yeah.
Because other places, if you need a wheelchair or a mobility, you have to pay a fee.
Yeah.
And our plan was not to pay, but
right.
council or someone, they're always looking for resources.
100%, 100%. And the thing is, though, you're not required under the ADA to provide that. You're doing it as a courtesy.
Correct.
And so you can't charge people to make something accessible that you're doing as a courtesy as well. Okay. So there's kind of that double thing, but that's a good question. Physical site audits. These are the ones that y'all are probably more familiar with than when you're looking at programs and policies and all that. This is literally, and this goes back to the 2010 standards. How high, how wide, how many. Okay? That's a sidewalk. That's the slope on a sidewalk. You know what the slope on a sidewalk is supposed to be? Not 8%. Not 8%. But so physical audits, you're going to go out and you're going to go through every single one of the standards in the 2010 guidelines. There's a lot of standards. And unfortunately for us in Park and Recreation, there aren't standards that go, hey, splash pads, these are the ones. Hey, benches, these are the ones. Hey, batting cages, these are the ones. So you have to be pretty familiar with the standards in order to do those.
I'm sorry to ask.
No, please.
On the sidewalks and the slope, we do have some that are 12%. And we say slope is greater than block on the side. But when we do the slope, we have the platform, and then the slope, and then the platform. We don't have to change any of that. What is the standard? I should never ask.
Here, Terry knows what my answer is going to be. Mm-hmm.
That's her answer to everything.
That is. It depends. Because it depends. So, and the things it depends on was, when was it built? What's the topography that was not?
Yeah, it's topography, just because it's beside the road, and the road is like this.
Is it attached to the road? Is it part of the road? Is it DOT? Is it not? Your sidewalk is DOT?
Well, no, DOT gifted it to us.
Don't ever take sidewalks from DOT. Don't ever take sidewalks from DOT. Do not. There's a reason they're giving them to you. And they have a different set of standards. And one of the things that they get to say is, the roadbed was at a 15%. We're good. And so they gifted you a problem. Don't ever take stuff from DOT. Just don't do it.
And it's no stairs anywhere else, but we have another place that's modifications someone can. I don't need to change that one if I have another access point that is no different than a walking person to someone who needs assistance, correct?
It depends.
Oh,
I'm not answering that trap. I'm not answering, especially since you already gave up that it was DOT. Nope, not answering that. But it does. A lot of this depends. It depends on a lot of things. There are times when true topography does impact it. It truly does. There are times when it does. And you make an alternative route and you sign it and you say, the accessible route is this way. This is not it. But you have to do it within a certain amount of space. One of the things, too, that's really different between self-evaluations with all the other things you do and the standards that are here, the how high, how wide, how many. The standards are not meant to look at accessibility and inclusion for people who have any type of IDD, which is intellectual developmental disability. So autism, somebody who has Down syndrome. It's not meant for anybody who has any type of behavioral health. It is not meant for anybody who has um, any type, certain types of physical disabilities. That's not who it was developed for. There are three primary areas: vision, well, four: vision, speech, hearing, and mobility. So when you look at the standards, those are the things that it focuses on. So sometimes when you ask the question about, hey, I've got stairs here and it's the closest path, and then we've got ramps that are around it, is that accessible? Because, if you have a wheelchair, you have to go down here. Is that accessible? It really is. It depends, but that might be the most inclusive. But it might not, by the standard, be the most accessible. And it might be the most inclusive because if you have somebody who has fibro, or if you have somebody who's had a stroke and they need to be able to use stairs because they need the handrail for balance as opposed to using the ramp, that might be the best path of travel for them and the most accessible path of travel for them. But depending on how that ramp is, it might not be the most ADA compliant. Okay, so there's a huge difference between compliance, access, accessibility, and inclusive. Huge difference. Okay, so y'all love this sidewalk? I love this sidewalk. It's in my neighborhood. It's a park in my neighborhood. You have to look at your sidewalks. Not only do you have to look at the slope on it, and that's the slope for it next to it. And this is my handy dandy. I actually owe April for this recommendation many years back. She was like, "Oh, did you see this fun new tool we got?" And it was myself and another person out there. And we were like, "No, what is it?" This is the best thing in the world. I love it. It's called a Mosier, and it helps you do slopes. It measures for you. It now does fill, and I mean, it does all kinds of stuff. You can overlay it with all kinds of things, and it helps me when I'm auditing, and I can look at something, and I can even, we did recently, I audited a playground surface that had some issues with leveling, and we were able to get the depths and everything of where it was. So you can look at those type of things. Because sometimes when you're doing these physical audits, it's not always evident to you. You can look at this and say, hey, there's a lot of cracks, but you also need to be able to measure slopes and see kind of if it's compliant within those as well. You're going to need to measure doors. How hard is it to pull? How hard is it to push? 5 pounds is the maximum. Y'all know 5 pounds is not much. Doors, toilets, water fountains, anything that you've got, gate latches, push pulls. You measure all of those. You measure heights of signs. I love this one. What you can't see on this one, it's great. It's compliant. There's all kinds of things with the parking. The sign is in the right place, all that wonderful thing. It is, I was kind of afraid to tell them this because it's a police building. And it was kind of like, y'all know you're not why. They had asked me to do it, but it was kind of like, I don't know if I would have told them. Because they have accessible parking on both sides of their entrance, right? The one on the left goes back, we were talking about stairs. It says, this is not the accessible, if you need a ramp, it's over here, but you can use that if you want to. And so you've got accessible parking here, and it's the van accessible parking, and there's a whole bunch of rules about how many you have to have that are van accessible versus traditionally accessible. So the van parking, accessible parking is here, and then on this side, which is the side you're seeing, is where it's more the ambulatory parking, accessible parking, and it goes to the ramp. Anybody see the problem here with the story I just told you? Well, let me tell you again. No, but it doesn't have to always be directly. It has to be with that space. So here's the story again. There's 2 accessible parking spots. One of them is a van accessible parking spot, which means that somebody is going to be using a van, which means they're going to have a wheelchair lift in it, right? And in front of it is the path of travel. There's a great set of stairs that are there that you could use if you did just have maybe some balance or other things. And then there's path of travel that goes across. And then there is a traditional accessible parking, and it goes up to the ramp. Anybody see the problem? Right? So the van, they just need to flip them. A lot of times you're doing the right thing, and you think you're doing the right thing, and we've got our van accessible, and we've got our ramp, and we've got this set, but you have to think through the process of it. No offense to, because this is a great building. A lot of times we do things and think about how we're doing. We think about what's going to be accessible, what's going to be universally accessible, all of that. But because, again, these standards talk to mobility, hearing, visual, and speech, right? They don't talk to IDD. They don't talk to those type of things. When you go into the restroom, it's great, right? Automatic lights, automatic toilet flushes, universal. A lot of the things like that came out of the ADA because it's universal use, right? You don't have to worry about which side the flush handle is on, all that stuff. There is an amazing, amazing automatic hand dryer, right? It meets the requirements of the ADA. But is it inclusive? No. Why not? It's loud. And why does that matter? If you have any type of sensory disability, that's going to be an issue. So a lot of places when you go in and you'll see the hand dryer, the automatic hand dryer, a lot of times you'll also see the manual hand dryer with the towels. That's why, is because people are looking at that universal. So there's, and that goes back to too why it depends. You have to have access in your beaches. You have to have physical access. When you're doing these, like I was saying, there's tons and tons and tons of guidances and standards. These are just a couple of them. There's a difference on what the standard is if it's a hanging toilet versus if it's a floor-mounted toilet. There is a difference in where your curb cuts are. Is it at the circle of it, or is it at the side? Where is it at? Those things are different. It's going to be just looking at pool lifts alone. Anybody have swimming pools under your swimming pools? Do you have pool lifts? Yes. Can I go up to the pool lift and access it without you asking you to turn it on for me? Can I, since they're already out of the game on that, since I can use it without asking you, are you going to help me lower down and help me get back up? What if I? Yay! Are you going to ask me how much I weigh? How do you know?
Because I was involved in that because I took narcotics. And my husband's a very large man, and so I'm very huge, very active. And so those are 600-pound lifts. So it's very, very rare that someone will be a little bit bigger than that.
And those are the things that when you're thinking through things, it's not just on the standard. But what is on the standard is you are required, if I come out and I see the lift, and I need to use the lift. You don't need to know why I need to use the lift, but if I need to use the lift, I get on the lift, I should be able to have it on. I should be able to operate it. I should be able to lower it. I should be able to get out, do whatever I'm doing in the pool, and then I should be able to get back on it and come up. If you're requiring people to ask you to turn it on, or if you're requiring people to have you use it, you are not compliant with the ADA. And that's some of the standards that are part of this. What's not part of the standards, but a lot of people, again, it's that difference between compliant, accessible, inclusive, right? So inclusive is that if there is a lift, a lot of the pool lifts go to like 250, 300. No. Why would you do that when there are lifts that go to 6? Then you don't get into other people's business. You don't end up having to, and that's what makes it inclusive. You're not then having to go, Daniel, how much do you weigh before you get on this lift? Well, then you can't use the lift. And that's where people end up starting to go, right? A lot of times, and then staff gets in all kinds of trouble because they're like, well, they told me you can't use it if. And they're just doing what they've been told, right? So if you look at that, not only what the requirements are, but the inclusive part of it, it adds more to what you do. What your end result is going to be after you've done all of this self-evaluation on everything, and then you've done all your physical assets on everything, every single thing that you have that's a physical access, everything, tables, chairs. You even, when you're doing it and you're looking at the administrative part, most people do. Most people do. That's kind of our nature to do this. We want to be able to say, if somebody is renting a facility, here's our table setup. Which one do you want? Right? Is that table setup accessible? But is it accessible? I've got places here that, depending on how we've got people set, like hidden behind or whatever, right? So they're not always accessible. The good thing is most people have gone now to using not fixed. So you've got chairs that can be moved, those type of things. But you do still have to look at your tables and see if underneath, because there are requirements for knee space and toe space. So you can't tell if the middle is probably accessible, but the sides are not, because I can't get knee or toe space. I can't get those. So your end result is going to be your self-evaluation, all of the details with that, and you're going to detail out everything you found. You like my tiny house? I've got maintenance people that still won't talk to me because of that. Just saying. They built it out. It's a great idea. But I got maintenance guys that still won't talk to me anymore. We still use it, but they still won't talk to me. Everything that you found in your self-evaluation, you're going to detail out. And you're going to put it into a nice format. The other thing is, everything you found in your physical assessments, you're going to detail it out. And this is where your transition plan is. A lot of people think it's all one thing. Your book is going to be, all of your plan is going to end up being your self-evaluation and transition plan. The transition plan, the ADA lists some very specific things that have to be part of your transition plan. You have to have a list of all your physical barriers. And again, this is not meant as a gotcha. I've had people before say, if we say it, then we're liable for it. The reality of it is, if you don't say it and you don't have a plan for it, and I will send this to you if you need, if anybody needs, I'll send stuff to you. If you don't say it and you don't have it listed out and you don't have a plan for it, that's when you're liable for it. If you get a complaint and you go, yeah, we didn't know it was like that. Why not? Yeah, we knew it was like that, but we don't have a plan for it because we didn't want to say anything. That's when you're liable for it. If you have a plan, if you have a list, it's not a gotcha, I promise. You need to have a list of all of your barriers, every single every single barrier. Then you have to have how you're going to fix those barriers. Whatever it's going to be, how are you going to fix it? And this is where you're going to run headlong into whoever handles your money. Just saying. We'll talk about that in a minute. But this is where you're going to run headlong into them, because you have to have a method for how that's going to be removed. If it's something that cannot be done immediately and corrected immediately, you need to have a plan. So if you have a concession stand that has a service height that is above 34 and you need it to be compliant, but you know that it's not going to be able to be done this cycle, next cycle, whatever, have a plan for it. Again, it goes back to the, kind of like the same with the food truck. We're going to go out and ask them what they need, and we're going to serve from there. Have a plan. Have an access plan for it. Then you need to have a schedule for removal. These are all non-negotiables, by the way. These are listed in the ADA saying you will, you will, you will. So it's not like you're making this up. You have to have a schedule for removal. Now, you don't have to have a 1 year, 2 year, 3 year schedule for removal. You don't. You could technically have a 10-ish year, maybe a 15, but remember, this all had to be fixed 32 years ago. So when you say we didn't have time, the DOJ is going to go, okay. So you can have a plan. It cannot be, we've got it sometime in the next 30, 40 years, whatever. If you use a capital improvement plan, if you use a budgeting, whatever you use to identify how your projects are going to happen, you need to put it on there and make sure, okay? So you have to have a schedule for improvement. Then this part is always the fun part. You have to have a responsible staff. Who is going to be responsible for it? And you can't say the director. You can't say the maintenance supervisor. You have to say Daniel Leatherman is responsible for getting this fixed. You have to name names on this document. So North Carolina is Daniel Leatherman. That's it. You're welcome. There you go. You have to name names. So the ADA requires that you don't just generically say it's going to be this. You have to say who is actually going to be the responsible person.
Can you write titles as opposed to names? No.
You're supposed to name names. Now, yes. 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 Well, you're a little too familiar with that whole thing. You just said that's a Department of Justice. We have to do it. Okay. But you have to name names. Now, well, part of that is going to mean that once you have your plan, if those people leave, you have to update it.
So this is a tricky question. A lot of the facilities we use for our programming and our youth athletics are and those facilities like
It depends. It really does. And the reality of it is that there are times. I'm going to tell you you should, and then I'm going to acknowledge the reality. The you should not be holding programs in inaccessible spaces, and that's a requirement of the law. If you know it's not accessible, you should find an alternative place to have it. That's the law. That's the you should. The reality is not every community has that option, and you sometimes have to do what you have to do. So you need to then kind of program to the people who, so if somebody says, hey, I need a modification, you move it. And that's an unfortunate reality. A lot of, especially smaller communities, use their faith-based organizations, because, again, I grew up in the South. Y'all can pick which denomination I was. But we always had a gymnasium, right? We had a really good gymnasium. So we had a lot of community groups that used it. There's a lot of small communities. That's where their recreation resources are, are with their churches and their synagogues and their, a lot of other places, it's going to be with their school system. And that's going to be your option. So that you should and the reality sometimes have to balance out. So you should be programming somewhere else. The reality is sometimes there's not other places to program. Yeah. So once you get all that with your transition plan, you then have to monitor the progress. You have to track what's happening. You have to monitor the progress. And then this is the best one. And I had somebody yell at me about this. I had a money person yell at me about this, like, hi, money person, yell at this. Maintenance of accessible features. Because just because it was compliant when you built it doesn't mean it's compliant today, right? Because we don't, in general, in park and recreation, just deal with these great places like this, where you can look at plans and you can get them all set and get it built. And unless there's something majorly happening with the foundation, chances are this building is going to stay compliant. What might not stay compliant is if you change out your toilet paper rolls, if you have to replace toilets, urinals, sinks, that might be where your compliance is. But in general, inside spaces are going to stay compliant. What's not going to stay compliant are our outside spaces. This is my example of you have to monitor progress. Brand new facility. Brand new facility. Built. Great. Brand new facility. And when they went to install it, there's an internal standard that there is space, and it's on the plans. It's on the plans, the architectural plans. When it's built, the internal standard was instead of having companion seating only on one side of the bench, we have companion seating on both. That's an internal standard. It's on the plans. Apparently, the installers cannot read the plans because they were like, that didn't make sense, so we're just going to put it here. And the folks who were supposed to be monitoring that didn't. And they let them install all the benches like that. And then the answer was, well, we didn't want to have to pull them up and make them move it to the right place so there was, because then they would have to fill the holes. Or you could have monitored the progress of making sure it was done, right? So that's a lot of times where things happen. I love this one. Is this not wonderful? It's been there for 2 years. No, it is not a pond. We have named it the Caverns. It is now the Caverns, and you can hear the pond running through it if you go up to it, and you can see where it's starting to collapse, which is fun, and you see our lovely park right behind it. This is an example of maintenance of accessible features. Just because you built it compliant, which it wasn't, but it was close. It was. Just because you built it compliant does not mean it's always going to be compliant. We build outside things. A lot of our facilities are outdoors. They're exposed to all kinds of things. And whether it's the weather doing things or vandals or leaky old infrastructure pipes that slowly erode away from it. Yeah, if y'all want to know where the caverns are, we're getting ready to put up signs for it. Just saying. Our neighborhood is getting ready to put up signs. Welcoming everybody to our caverns. But you have to maintain those, and that's where a lot of compliance and accessibility is. One of the last things you have to do, and you should be doing this throughout, is you should be getting public input. It goes back again, nothing about us without us. Get public input, because there are people who are going to see things that you don't see.
But how do we have public engagement.
How do you find people?
Yeah, how do we, now we got Kennedy Strong, the local organizations that assist with all different levels of support that's needed. Advocacy groups and all that, but just the citizen, it's hard to get them to come.
Yeah, it is.
Going through them.
Yeah, just in general, it's hard to get people to come out. Let's face it. Unless they're mad. Well, you could make them mad, and then, yeah, you don't want to do that. But it, you have to keep trying. You have to look at how you're trying to engage people. Are you expecting them to come to you?
No.
Or are you going to them?
Well,
are you getting on their support group meetings and saying, hey, We got this. Are you getting with the PTA and saying, hey, can we come and present to the PTA? Are you going to the Alzheimer's Association and say, I know you'll have monthly support group meetings. Can we come and tell you what we've got? Right? So a lot of it has to do with just how you try to engage people. And reality, again, is that sometimes we're asking people who have disabilities to do something that's going to create more of a problem, right? Y'all, if y'all know any, and I'll just, whether it's parent or caregiver, whoever it is, time is precious. And when you've got somebody who maybe needs additional support and you're working all day, and then we're asking them to come to a community workshop at 6 o'clock at night, it's not happening. It's not happening. So you have to just kind of look alternatively, and get with support groups. If you, seriously, if you know a mom's group or a dad's group or a homeschool group, put something out to them, because they will march with it. They'll march with it. It's whether they have somebody in their world with a disability or not, and they'll put it out to folks. That's one of the best ways. Or get people mad, and they can do it that way. EC teachers.
Outside of the school,
yes.
They know what works and doesn't work outside of school.
100%. So get in with your schools. If you've got, there's a lot of schools as districts as well in North Carolina, which I find really odd, that have specialized schools for kids with public specialized schools. And I find that so really odd, because that's like so not legal. But parents want that. And so I find it just kind of odd, but they're also a really great resource. Use what's there. Use what's around. Lastly, before we finish up real quick, these are the reasons why we do this. Over 1 in 4 of today's 20-year-olds will become disabled before they retire. 1 in 4 of today's 20-year-olds. 1 in 36 kids are identified as being on the spectrum. This is the most recent numbers. This is for North Carolina specifically. 13.7% of all individuals living in our communities in North Carolina have a disability. So when people say not in my community, 13, almost 14% of all North Carolinians have a disability. And I guarantee you that number will continue to rise because of people like me. I am on that baby boomer cusp. And the more of us there are, the more people there are with disabilities. We are going to have heart attacks. We are going to have strokes. We're going to have dementia. We're going to have Alzheimer's. We're going to have diabetes, and we're going to have amputations. And because there's so many of us, it's going to continue to skew the number of people who have disabilities. Yeah. It's all you are, temporarily able-bodied. So 13.7% of North Carolinians. And here's the thing that really is very impactful, because this is put out by NRPA. Only 2 in every 5 park and recreation departments have a formal inclusion plan to ensure access to parks by people with disabilities. Only 2 in 5. That's a staggering number. And it's not that people don't care. A lot of times it goes back to kind of what you're talking about. You're the only one, or you're one of 2 or 3, or you're one of 4 or 5, or you're up against other people. But there are ways to start making that needle move. Okay? And lastly, this is Judith Heumann. And if you've ever heard about the movie Crip Camp, you've seen her in that. She was a pioneer in disability rights. She was also involved in what was called the Capitol Crawl. And it was pre-ADA. And if you don't know what the Capitol Crawl is, do go back and look. She was from New York. She had to fight to get into schools, public schools. Then when she finally did that, she had to fight to go to college. Like literally, they're going, no, you use a wheelchair, you can't go. She had to fight to do that. She ended up with a teaching degree. She had to fight to get a job as a teacher. She's been involved. She passed away recently. She's been involved with disability rights literally since she was a child, when her parents first started really advocating for her. She was involved in the Capitol Crawl, and again, if you don't know what that is, look it up. It is pre-ADA, and it was where a group of U.S. citizens had to get out of their wheelchairs and literally crawl up the steps of the U.S. Capitol because there was no access to one of the most powerful buildings in our nation. So she was involved with that, and this is one of my favorite quotes from her. It is no longer acceptable to not have women at the table. It is no longer acceptable not to have people of color at the table, but no one thinks to ask if the table is accessible. So what our role is to start asking, is the table accessible? And if it's not, finding a way to make it accessible. Finally, thank you. Thank y'all for letting me come talk to y'all. I know it's a whole lot of information in a really short period of time. I've got cards up here. You're welcome to grab a